This lecture is supported by the Zora and Z. Ahmed Foundation, which is the philanthropic arm of the associated group, who sponsor a lot of major literary and cultural events in Lahore, including the recently held Lahore Literary Festival. Today, the foundation is actually working in Joseph Colony, and therefore their representatives are not here, but we want to thank them for making this lecture possible. There is a connection which goes back in history, because Mr. Z. Ahmed was a student of Faiz at the MAO College in Amritsar. So it's really very nice that there should be a collaboration between the Faiz Foundation Trust and the Zora and Z. Ahmed Foundation. I'd like to now hand over to our host for the evening, Mrs. Naveed Shahzad.
On behalf of the Faiz Foundation, I take great pleasure in welcoming you all here this evening. The distinguished speaker at the Faiz Memorial Lecture 2013 is a man who appears to be cast in a mold similar to the one that Faiz himself perfected. Fearless, courageous, a man of conviction and formidable integrity. Uncompromising in his critique of established canons, he is unafraid to challenge writers even of the caliber of Naipaul and Tagore. He spent his childhood in a tiny called Sirsi, in the lap of what he calls a fading medieval India. Enchanted by performances of tales from the Mahabharata, staged by lamplight, and the most rudimentary of performance areas, he confesses, "I was young, and the magic stayed with me." It is fortunate for us that this early magic has kept him company. For the young man yearning to be an English poet while working at a hateful math syllabus, suddenly metamorphosed into a playwright writing in Kannada. The chrysalis turned butterfly never looked back after his first play, Yayati, written in 1961. He has since, and unlike contemporaries Badal Sarkar and Vijay Tendulkar, chosen to dwell in what he calls a new world of magical possibilities. The marriage between mythology and tradition on the one part, and a modern, relevant, informed sensibility has been an international success for the last 52 years. A Rhodes Scholar, Fulbright Fellow, he has headed the Film and Television Institute at Pune, acted as chairman of the Sangeet Natak Academy in India, received a Doctor of Letters degree from the University of Karnataka and the Padma Bhushan from the Government of India, among a host of national and international accolades. Of this incredible journey, he writes, "I've been an actor, a publisher, a filmmaker. But in none of these fields have I felt quite so much at home as in playwriting." And in that role, ladies and gentlemen, he has embraced his native traditional themes and language while honing his craft on the lodestone of voracious reading in history and philosophy, form and structure in the works of Sartre, Ibsen, Anouilh, Brecht, and Thomas Mann, to list but a few. For him, myths provided the fables, a complex of action and character which assumed the shape of drama. But this is not all. To be recognized as a man of ideas is to be blessed. To be recognized as a man of letters is to be twice blessed. But to be a visionary is a destiny reserved for the very few. In the spirit of the Renaissance. Our speaker today ranks among the few chosen ones. In cinema, from the iconic Manthan to present-day Ekta Tiger. In literature, from Yayati and Tughlaq to the prolific body of work up to the present. In bridging the linguistic divide between native Kannada and universal English. In searching for completeness and using myth to expose the absurdity of life. In voicing his all-encompassing humanism, like Faiz, I quote him from his play, Taledand, after the Babri Masjid episode. He says, this is one of his characters speaking, violence is wrong, whatever the provocation. To resort to it because someone else started it first is even worse. And to do so in the name of structures of brick and mortar is a monument of stupidity. Today, as we mourn yet another incident of religious discrimination, I believe Faiz, wherever he is, would be pleased to see this speaker take his own legacy further. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Girish Karnad.
Namaskar. Assalamu alaikum. Let me say how overwhelmed I am to be here this evening. I mean, how grateful I am to the Faiz Foundation for inviting me here. Salima ji, Moneeza, everyone else who's connected with it. Because Faiz isn't anymore just an Pakistani poet. He is a poet of subcontinental recognition, and in India he's already becoming acknowledged as one of the native poets. In fact, when I was coming here, I bought a copy of the journal Outlook, and there inside it was a news report with photographs of an exhibition that's going on in Bombay by the famous Indian painter Nalini Malani, and with installations and so on. And the whole exhibition is a tribute to Faiz Ahmad Faiz. What was nice about it is that those at the Faiz Foundation didn't know anything about it, which shows that Faiz has become independent of the foundation. There is a presence beyond that. Now, yesterday I told, this is my second visit to Lahore, and I'm delighted to be here. The first visit was a great experience. Yesterday I've already told a story that happened last time, but I can't stop myself from repeating it for the people who weren't there yesterday, which is that when I was here last time, I had some problems with my passport. I had to report to the police, and I didn't. So there was a possibility that I might get arrested. So I thought of whom to contact, and I contacted Salima ji, and I rang her and said, can you do something to prevent me from getting arrested by the police? And she said, well, I don't know, I don't think I can help you with the police, but I can recommend the best prison cell in Lahore, because my father was there for many years. So, well, as it turned out, it was okay, because the police officer had seen a Hindi film in which I had acted and even remembered the dialogues and gave me a cup of tea. So, well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Faiz was a poet. I always wanted to be a poet. I grew up believing that I wanted to be a poet, because that was the ultimate summum bonum of one's existence. Unfortunately, when I was about 22, I suddenly wrote a play instead, and I wrote it in Kannada. I wanted to be a poet in English. Instead, I wrote a play in Kannada, and I knew, it came with such a rush, I knew that I would never be a poet. It broke my heart, really. And I accepted, and I have been since then a playwright, writing plays and so on. Having said that, I would like to dwell a little bit on this whole position of what it is to be a playwright. Now, usually it seems very straightforward what a playwright is. A playwright is someone who writes plays. I mean, therefore, he's a playwright. And the earliest playwrights in India, were the Sanskrit playwrights, those who go back to the 3rd century BC. And most people here probably don't know that the first Sanskrit plays were written in Pakistan. I mean, they were written in northwest frontier. They were written near Islamabad, on life of Buddha and so on. And so the tradition goes back actually into ancient Pakistani history. And after that, from the 3rd century BC, with people, playwrights like Bhasa and Kalidasa and so on, Kalidasa, of course, you've heard of, the great playwright, it goes on till about the 7th or the 8th century in Sanskrit playwrights. And then all playwriting stops. No language in India then produces any plays. This is an amazing phenomenon. For a whole 1,000 years after that, there is no play in India, no play produced in India, no play written in India, till the 19th century. Now, this didn't mean that there were no plays happening. It didn't mean that plays were not produced. Plays were produced, a lot of performances were there. What was happening was that those in the Indian subcontinent didn't believe that a play should be written down. The whole idea that a playwright sat there and he wrote out the play and he wrote out the whole dialogue, and those dialogues were then wrote by actors who then came and rehearsed and did them. The whole idea was foreign to Indians. The whole idea was to improvise. Actors came on stage as they do in Nautanki today, and that's the tradition that happens in all this. This tradition of improvisation continued, and so an actor had to know his dialogue, whether he was doing it from Mahabharata or whether he was doing it from Shahnama or whatever it is, and then had to improvise the whole scene. Actors were brought for the first time together on stage, and they faced each other, and they created a play. You see, so from about the 8th century AD, the first plays that were written are then in the 19th century. And I think among the first ones to be written again was Indra Sabha, which was produced by Nawab Wajid Ali Shah in Lucknow, you see. So there is this whole 1,000 year of interregnum when there are no plays, and suddenly in the 19th century plays begin. You get people like Agha Hashar Kashmiri, you get other playwrights, and this is the moment I want to talk about today, as to what happens in the 19th century, what are the problems created, or what are the challenges created by the new colonial regime which the English brought to India, which brought a new cultural awareness in India, a new cultural phenomenon, like writing plays. Now this is only, I'm taking it a beginning point. You see, the British brought two elements in India, which of course affected our lives very radically. First one, of course, the English language. I can now speak to you because they brought the English language. But it also meant that because we were taught after 1833, everything, Persian was denied, Sanskrit was denied, they taught us to think in terms of categories borrowed from abroad. You know, even simple things like religion, think like faith, a thing like joint family, even a simple thing like cousin. You know, where you use an English phrase, you think now in terms of the meanings given to it by the European civilization. You know, and therefore what the learning in English did to us was to make us think in terms of categories which were borrowed from the West and by Western discourse. This is one thing. I won't talk about it much because it has been much talked about earlier. The second thing they did was they created colonial cities. They created the major colonial cities were in fact Calcutta and Chennai and then Bombay, and a fourth city which was not as important in those periods was Karachi. And all four of them were ports. These, I call them colonial cities because there was no cities existed in these places earlier. They were usually fishermen's paradises, as it were, little portholes where fishermen lived, and the British came, they started trading from this thing, and Indian traders gathered around them. And slowly these places, which were ports of trade, slowly developed into cities where people came, and they developed into cities of their own. So these are colonial cities again. Now there were traditional Indian cities like Lahore, for instance, Delhi, for instance, Nagpur, Mysore, and so on. Now the difference between these traditional Indian cities and the new colonial cities is really at the heart of what's happened to us. Because in the traditional cities like Lahore, there was a whole continuity of values between the city and the outside. People who lived in the city and the people lived in the countryside shared values. They're the same set of values about how to live, what God meant, what was the relationship to your parents, how to, and so on. And these shared values meant that the city and the countryside continued a cultural continuity. Even where craftsmen were concerned, even if you were to build houses and so on, you always went, the craftsmen lived in the countryside, came to the city, built your houses and went back to their villages. So there was this continuous a unity of beliefs that tied the city to the countryside. What happened with the colonial cities was that a total disjuncture. Because these colonial cities, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, actually had begun as trading posts by the British and had built the British ambience, there was continually, all the people who came there pretended at least the Indians, pretended to believe in Western values. The dominating principle was free trade. Free trade came, then there was individualism. Then, there was a thing like there shouldn't be nepotism. And things like caste or family or joint family were looked down upon. Individual initiative, meritocracy, all kind of new ideas came which denied the traditional family setup or the traditional social setup, and brought to us values which were borrowed from free trade society of Britain. And this changeover that came because of this meritocracy is beautifully summed up by one paragraph on Umrao Jan Ada. If you read the novel Umrao Jan Ada, as you know, this was supposed to be written by the courtesan of Lucknow soon after 1857, after Nawab Wajid Ali Shah was taken down. And Umrao Jan tells a story which is absolutely lovely in its resonance. She says there was a young prince, young Nawab, and he fell in love with a young courtesan, and he pursued her and she rejected him, and he didn't know what to do. So he went and jumped into the river, and he jumped and tried to commit suicide, but because of his robe, he floated down the river. And as he was floating down the river, the Nawab came in his boat, and because on his what in Sanskrit would be called nauka vihar, the boat ride and so on. And he saw this spectacle of this young man floating down the river, and he fished him out. And he asked the young man, what's went wrong? And the young man said, I'm heartbroken, I'm trying to commit suicide, and so on. And the Nawab was so touched that he made him an officer of the state. And because the Nawab was an educated young man, he became a very good officer of the state, and a very successful officer. Having told this story, then Umrao says, such beautiful things used to happen in the days of old. But now that the British have come, nothing matters except merit. So if you are not merited, you don't become an officer. That's it. These beautiful romantic stories don't happen. But this passage which is there, in fact, sums up how the psychological transition had taken place from the traditional city to what might be called the colonial city. And it's in this context that I want to look at two things that the British brought to our society. The main thing of all the activities they brought, the one that was imitated widely in Bombay and Calcutta and Madras was theatre. They brought theatre. In fact, as I said, one of the first early plays was written by Nawab Wajid Ali Shah's court, Indra Sabha, and that was one of the first plays to be done. The whole idea of theatre becoming acceptable was thanks to the British. Until the 19th century in India, theatre was looked down upon. Any kind of entertainment was looked down upon. It was a thing that the lower caste people did. But the British, indulged in theatre. They had plays, Goldsmith, Sheridan, occasionally Shakespeare. They did them in clubs. The Mem Sahib used to act in them. And the Indians were not allowed to look at them, So that made it even more mysterious because, the natives were not allowed to look, see and Mem Sahib. And in imitation of this, theatre started first in Calcutta and then in Bombay. And these theatres brought in two concepts which were very interesting. One was the proscenium. Until then, when a play took place or any performance took place or any ritual took place, it didn't take place inside proscenium. It was open and audiences to come, and there was a flow of this between the actors and the audience. That was the. But there was a second thing, initiative which the British did, which changed the whole notion of entertainment in India, which was the idea of ticketing. They brought the idea that you had to buy tickets to see a show. Now, until the 19th century, this was completely unacceptable in the Indian society. What used to happen is that the prince, the king, the wazir, the nawab, or whoever it is would organize a show, and people would be invited. They would be allowed to come and watch. The whole financial risk was taken by the minister or whoever it is who was organizing. Very often in India, in the Hindu society, for instance, if someone wanted a son or a daughter, he would go to a temple and he will say, if I have a son, then I'll organize some scene from the Mahabharata. And then he would, if the son was born, he would have a Mahabharata scene, and everyone was invited. The whole notion that the audience should pay to see entertainment was foreign to to the Indian society completely. But so what it meant then was that there was, so far as the audience was concerned, there was no financial risk. And because there was no financial risk, what was allowed was improvisation. As you know, Indian music is dependent on improvisation. You allow the musician to develop an alap or develop a rag as he likes. And that risk that something may go wrong, that an alap is only possible when the audience is not taking any financial risk. In fact, it reaches a point, in fact, where now, I don't know in Pakistan, but certainly in India, the singer is revered to such an extent that they are allowed anything. I mean, I have seen Bhimsen Joshi come completely drunk and fall asleep on stage. He came and sat there and he fell asleep. Then there was a Mahalingam, there was a flutist called Mahalingam in Chennai, who came drunk 2 nights completely. The audience came, it sat, waited, he couldn't drink. Third day, he came, prostrated himself, and he played beautifully all night, and everyone only talked of how beautifully he had played. You see, the 2 nights where he had come drunk was forgiven, because this is what artists do. This was and this whole notion that artists can take a risk and the audience can take a risk with the artist may work, artist may not work, really comes from the fact the audience didn't really actually have any financial risk. But what happens as soon as you start ticketing, in fact, is that the audience pays 5 rupees. And when it pays 5 rupees or 10 rupees or whatever it's paid, it's promised something. It's promised 8 songs, 10 dances, 15 spectacles, whatever it is. And when the audience doesn't get that 8 songs or 10 spectacles, it complains. It says, this is ridiculous. I've paid now money for it. And, so as a result, entertainment got commodified in India. It became like buying a soap. You buy a 5 rupee soap and an 8 rupee soap. And similarly, for a particular show, if there was... And so the whole Natak company tradition, which comes up in the 19th century thanks to the British tradition, therefore treats entertainment as a commodity. The whole concept of ritual, the whole concept of participation, or of traditional values involved in it is gone. People come to buy to buy entertainment, really, like buying a soap, and the entertainment is then goes through 2 processes. One thing is that the audience, when it pays, knows what it's to get and wants that thing. Second thing, and this is the even more dangerous impact it had on Indian entertainment, was that every time it has to be replicated. If someone pays 5 rupees today and sees 8 songs, and tomorrow he comes and pays 5 rupees and gets 7 songs, he said, oh, but yesterday I had 8 songs, why did I get 7 songs today? You see, so it gets stratified, it's stultified, and the whole concept of entertainment becomes a sort of commodity that is sold in packaged goods. The thing that's what one sees in this process was that what was a vocation What was something that was done by people for whom it was a traditional profession which came down because they were singers, dancers, whatever it is, now becomes business. And because it's business, people come in. If you have money, you come in. As I said, till the 19th century, it was considered very low caste or low class, and it was done by certain people who were allowed to do entertainment. But after 19th century, what happens is entertainment becomes a business. And this is best seen in Bombay, for instance, although you can see it also in Calcutta, where the business was financed by the Parsis. The Parsis were business people. They put money into anything where they could make money. And they were really outsiders who had come from Persia, as you know. And they put money because they thought they could put money into the theater because they thought they could make money there. The audience was mainly Hindu. So most of the stories were actually from Mahabharata or Ramayana or whatever it is, so that it could attract Hindu audiences. But because the language that was most popular, most easily understood was Hindi or Urdu, most of the writers were Muslim. You had someone like Aga Hashra Kashmiri. So in fact, if you want a definition of secularism, you get it in Parsi theatre. Here's a Parsi financier financing a play which is for a Hindu audience, but really produced by a Muslim playwright, and very often Muslim singers and actors and so on. And this goes on. Now, another thing that the British did, along with producing this, was they presented Shakespeare. This was, part of the theatre tradition there. They presented Shakespeare as the great summum bonum of British culture. He was not, if they, and this created a problem for the Indians. You see, when a ruler says, I'm like this, the colonized people, the ruled people always want to match him. And if the British had said, we are represented by a great poet, we had great poets. Of course, we had, in Persian, in Sanskrit and so on, we had great poets, we had great singers if that had been represented and so on. If we had a Mozart or this to be done, we had equivalent singers. But we didn't have playwrights. As I said, there was a whole 1,000 years of playwriting, and now the British said that they were represented by Shakespeare, a playwright, and India had no playwrights. So we create playwrights. This is how in the 19th century, a whole new profession is created, almost of playwriting, of people who write, write down plays which have to be learnt and produced, and which fits into the commodified idea of entertainment. And you see that this there is a need arises in the Indian society to match up to this. If the rulers have a Shakespeare, who do we have? Do we have someone? We don't have. So what happens is everybody looks back at Sanskrit, because there's nothing in between. As I said, from the 6th century to 18th century, there was in fact no playwright. So they look back at Sanskrit, they look at it, and they find Kalidasa. Now there was this playwright called Kalidasa who was considered a great Sanskrit playwright, but he was never considered a great cultural icon. But in the 15th century, the British had discovered him, and Wilson Jones had said he was the Shakespeare of India and so on. So Kalidasa is revived and Kalidasa is presented, and we suddenly see in 19th century plays of Kalidasa being presented in Indian languages. In fact, it's very interesting that between 1860 and 1830 in Marathi, one of the languages, in Kalidasa was translated 6 times. 6 plays of Kalidasa were translated within 20 years, not one before then. And in a neighboring state, Kannada, there were 3 plays of Kalidasa, all translated at the same time. So there is a need for a playwright to come up and present. So you see a kind of cultural give and take in theatre, where the colonized people are trying to build a theatre which matches up to the image that's given to them by the British. And this is, the best example in fact is not really from Kannada, where I speak, but in Marathi, which is, as you know, the language of Maharashtra. The Marathi theatre begins in 1880 with proscenium, everything, And the first play produced by Anna Sahib Kirloskar was in fact Shakuntala written by Kalidas. And so you see immediately that he's trying to reach back, make himself respectable. In 1830s or 40s, no Brahmin would have touched, Anna Sahib Kirloskar was a Brahmin, no Brahmin would have touched theatre. But within 40 years, it becomes respectable enough for the Brahmins to take it up, Anna Sahib Kirloskar. And to show that it's respectable, he takes a Sanskrit play and he does Shakuntal. But the interesting thing is, he keeps a diary, Anna Sahib Kirloskar, and he says there that I want to create the rasa, rasa is the enjoyment of play. I want to create rasa in the English fashion. That is, the rasa is a Sanskrit word, but he wants to recreate it in the English fashion. Next play, another historical play called Savai Madhavrao and Samurtyu, in which the hero is modeled on Hamlet, who can't do anything, and the villain is modeled on Iago. And he just, as though these were not characters within a play, as though they were real characters, real people, and he takes Plonk, here Hamlet, here Iago, puts them together and writes a play. Which shows, in fact, that Shakespeare taught India not just plays, but real psychology. They learned their psychology not from text, but not from looking at people, but from looking at Shakespeare's plays, because until then, in Sanskrit plays and so on, really the characters were very much cardboard characters, a hero, heroine, this, that. And a third example, which is very interesting, is that there was a playwright called Gadkari who said he wanted to write only 18 plays. He would be happy if he wrote only 18 plays, because he knew that he was only half as good as Shakespeare. And Shakespeare had written 36 plays, you see. But what is interesting about Gadkari and all the people is they are all upper caste. They're Brahmins, they're Chitpan, they are. And the whole profession of theatre has become an upper caste theatre by 1880s, 1890s. And they take upper caste actors, they project upper caste way of life. The mythological characters in Kirloskar and other productions all behave as though they were the top class. The language they use and is upper caste. And the whole theatre becomes so upper caste that slowly those communities which had kept theatre going in India, which were considered low, are left out. And they are excluded. In fact, they are excluded completely from the theatre. And this is a process that is very interesting. That's very interesting to watch in the 19th century, because again and again, I'll take another example from painting later, quickly. Again, what happens is that traditionally, artists are considered lower caste. A particular profession is considered lower caste. Thanks to British influence, that becomes considered art. That becomes acceptable as profession or art by the upper caste. The upper caste take it up. They become the sponsors of it. And those people who had kept that art going over centuries are thrown out of it. And in the process, as I said earlier, all the artists used to live very often in the villages and used to come here and perform and go. Those artists are left out in the villages, and the art world becomes a very urban, bourgeois art form. It appeals to this. Now, another example of this is the example of painting, for instance. Now, in theatre, of course, the British didn't try to teach us theatre. They just did theatre by themselves. The Indians were so enamored with the theatre that they imitated them, tried to do them and learn. In painting, it was not like that. In painting, the British decided that Indians didn't know how to paint. And it's true that even during the Mughal period, the painters of the Mughal period admired British painters and the perspective and chiaroscuro and so on, and tried to imitate it. So but the British here decide that what is good with Indian artists is that they're good with design, they're good with line, they are good with flat pictures, but they're not good, they don't know the science of painting, and they start schools of art here with public instruction. They started one in Calcutta, one in Lahore, in fact a very famous one, and in Madras. And the purpose of these plays, of these schools of art, is to teach the traditional artisan, Indian artisan, how to make painting scientific, how to paint, use the scientific ideas of the West. But the whole philosophy comes from London. In London, what was happening at that time was there was the Royal Academy in Piccadilly, where you had people like Sir Joshua Reynolds and so on, who became great painters and, who used to paint there. And there was another school in South Kensington which was trying to save medieval crafts. The whole purpose was to save medieval crafts which are disappearing because of the Industrial Revolution. And that particular syllabus, which was worked out for the working class to save, is brought to India. And that is taught in the Indian art schools here. And the whole idea is that Indian craftsmen will come to these colleges and learn. But you see, the point is, all these colleges were in cities, and the craftsmen were in villages. If you start something in Calcutta, or if you start something in Bombay, probably in Lahore, the craftsmen were probably miles away from there. Then there were fees to be paid. The craftsmen had to come to learn their own craft, they had to pay fees. Then they had to buy equipment. And as a result, what happened was that the craftsman, the traditional artisan for whom painting was kept and painting was brought in by the British, were left out. And who went to these colleges of art? The bourgeoisie, the people, the middle class people from the cities. So if you look at Calcutta, for instance, it's people like Tagore, the family, Abanindranath Tagore or Gaganendranath Tagore. It's the middle class that takes over. And a whole new category emerges. Now, that's the interesting thing, is how culture is redefined continuously. Traditionally, Indian painters were always considered artisans. They were always considered, they were admired. There were some good painters whom we know about, but they were socially always considered a little below par. But now, a new category emerges in India, and that of the gentleman painter. And the gentleman painter, why does the gentleman painter paint? He paints because he's inspired to paint. Why does the artisan paint? He paints because he's taught to paint. He's learned whatever he has been done to do. He just passes it on. There is no. While so you have people like Tagore and so on sitting there and trying to express themselves. Now, the problem there with people like Gaganendranath Tagore or Abanindranath Tagore or Jamini Roy and others in Bengal, I'm taking that example because they became the most powerful, is that these were very intelligent people. And these intelligent people, they knew, they had read their James Mill, they had read their Rousseau, they had read their Voltaire and so on, and they knew that there was such a thing as a colonial influence that they wanted to avoid. And they had to find their own identity. So the whole question of identity, of what is Indian identity, comes out in painting in Calcutta. And the way they define that Indian identity is by inventing a completely new tradition for themselves, which goes back to Mughal paintings, Ajanta, Japanese paintings and so on. A whole category, a whole style of painting with shadowless figures and so on, which has nothing to do with what the painters and artisans are doing in the street. So, in fact, Indian painting loses completely any touch with this and suffers for it. As a result of it, Indian painting, I think, the 20s and 30s, you get this kind of Shantiniketan kind of painting, which you can now say, yes, it was okay, it was 1920s, but it's not great painting. In fact, the whole great tradition of painting, which had evolved through the medieval period and up to the 19th century, goes away, and we have this very truncated and damaged tradition in the 19th century. A similar thing, but the point again I want to make is what I made earlier, that in the process, all those castes and communities which had kept painting going are now considered artisans and treated with contempt, while art is considered an upper crust indulgence, of the urban population and so on, and of the bourgeoisie and so on. The same thing happens to a large extent in music. Now, I won't go into the details, but the point is that if you go to Madras and if you ask them, who was the first woman to sing in public, they will say Pattamar, and she sang in 1933. But the point is, Pattamar was the first Brahmin woman to sing. Before that, the temple dancers had been singing for generations in Karnataka, but their entire history has been wiped out. And both with dance and music, you have a very upper crust history of the forms that are given. Now, I won't go on with this. The point I want to make is that because of our confrontation with the British colonial system, our entire notion of culture undergoes a change. We redefine our arts, we redefine ourselves, and we redefine what we mean by art or what we mean by culture and so on. So now when we look back, or if we look at the influence of British influence, what do we see? How would one summarize what we got from them or didn't get from them? I'll try to summarize quickly and then conclude my lecture. You see, one can divide the arts into three different categories on how the British influenced it. The first was the category of music and dance and so on, which actually came out stronger because of the colonial influence. And the reason for it was the caste barriers and the community barriers that had kept these arts confined to certain caste and lower caste people and so on, or disappeared, and music became acceptable to the upper caste. You must remember that the one form, the only art form really I feel that is there rooted in every Indian home in the whole subcontinent is music. And the reason for that is that both the Sufis and the Hindu Bhakti poets, when there are weddings, there are funerals, everything, music becomes in fact the defining characteristic of the subcontinental character. And with the caste barriers that had kept them confined to, this, you can't sing music because it's associated with a particular caste and so on. With that disappearing, music really takes on in India. And today I think it's quite, I can say with all confidence that music today in India, I mean the whole of the subcontinent, is probably richer, more prolific, more productive than it has ever been in its entire history. Because all kinds of music is possible, all kinds of music is coming up, and that's one thing. The art forms that really suffered a great deal were the visual art forms. As I said, painting suffered, architecture suffered because they built all the buildings. I mean, once the British came over, almost every big building in India was built by British architects. And then in 20th century, you had these two super examples in India proper of two major cities. New Delhi was rebuilt when the British decided to move the capital from Calcutta to New Delhi. The New Delhi was rebuilt from 1913 to 1933, 20 years and so on. And the entire thing was designed by Lutyens and Herbert Baker and so on, was done by people who had contempt for Indian architecture, and Indian workers, Indian people who had traditionally carried on the building trade and the building were treated only to do menial work. And as a result, the whole art form was lost in the beginning. And then when India became independent, and we had to build, independent India had to build a city, Chandigarh, what do? We also again bring another Le Corbusier, another Frenchman comes, and Nehru told Le Corbusier, please build a city that no one has thought of completely, has nothing to do with tradition. And unfortunately, that's precisely what Le Corbusier does. And produces a city that's practically unlivable and now, in fact, unseeable also. And I think a pretty ugly city. But in the process, 100 years of an opportunity to build has been denied to the Indian architect at a grassroots level. And it's only in the 70s and the 80s that local architects start to emerge. In India at least, people like Charles Correa or Dubey or Doshi, they all come in the 80s and 70s. Nearly 150 years, the whole concept of Indian architecture. This architecture which had produced such marvelous structures as the Mughal constructions, the medieval constructions, the forts. I'll give you an example. If you go to many of these pilgrimage places in north, you see that people like Ahilyabai Holkar, who was a queen in Baroda, she has commissioned a caravanserai, a place where travelers can come and stay. You go there, it's beautifully built. It's there. Somewhere in some place of pilgrimage in a corner of India. Now, she couldn't have come and supervised it. She probably never came. She probably sent money saying, Kashi, the pilgrims will come, let them build. But the local tradition of building was so strong and so consistent that they could do it without some supervision. But the net result of the English intervention is we get the CPWD, what we call in India, the PWD architecture, which someone sitting centrally and designing and really literally destroying architecture completely here. And so on one side you get a category of arts which flourished, a category of arts like architecture and painting which suffered. And then of course there is a third category which comes from the technology we got from them, which came from the West. Of this, the earliest one was in fact photography. Photography came and transformed Indian landscape. In the West, we are told that with the coming of photography, painting suffered, that painting had to become, go into impressionism and expressionism because realism was taken over by photography and so on. That didn't happen in India. In India, photography flourished alongside painting. So you get in 19th century very good photography, particularly the princes, sponsoring it, along with paintings and so on and so on. Then the other thing that made completely transformed Indian cultural life was recording. With the recording of music, music comes out of the courts, music comes out of the kothis, it comes out of little places where people had to go. The music comes out as forms of records. 1902 was the first record made with Goharjan singing in Calcutta, and with that music becomes a part of Indian everyday life. And that is a major transformation in Indian cultural life, And it was it particularly was effective as when the films came. As you know, in 1930s, the new medium that came was in 1920s, that was films. But in the 20s, if you read about Indian films, you continually read complaints that they couldn't stand up to Hollywood, that that they couldn't compete with Hollywood films and so on, until music comes. Alamara, 1931, the first film which had 112 songs in it. Well, I don't think they sang for 5 minutes actually. They probably just sang a line or two or whatever it is. But anyway, 112 on record. With that, Indian film had never had to look back. You see, ultimately what survives, the Indian film industry survives because of music. And very often people complain to me when why are there people running around trees? Why are there so much dancing and so on? But I tell them, you don't realize, if they weren't running around trees, there would be no film industry in India. Because Hollywood would have swallowed us up. The whole point is, the West has this whole tradition of realism, in which, in fact, at the moment at least we can't compete with them. Whether it's in painting, whether it's in chiaroscuro, whether it's in perspective, whether it's in psychological depiction of a narrative in films or plays. They are supreme because they have been doing it for 200 years, 230 years. We don't have that. So, in fact, the thing is not to imitate them. I have made films much influenced by Satyajit Ray. Satyajit Ray made Pathar Panchali, which had no songs, and which was a masterpiece, and then he did films which are 4 or 5, all realistic and no songs and so on. And we all did that, Sham Benegal, me, because we felt having songs was somehow degrading and, films should not have songs. But now I feel, thank God we didn't succeed, because, if Indian film industry had lost the songs, then the whole film industry would have gone. I mean, when I was in college in the 1950s and 60s, France had Truffaut and Godard, and Japan had Ozu and Kurosawa, and so on. And Italy had, Antonioni and Fellini, and so on and so on. And we used to feel, why do we have only one filmmaker, Satyajit Ray, who's realistic? Why are we not like that? But now, if you look, there is no French film industry that's been swallowed up by Hollywood. There's no Japanese film industry that's been swallowed up by Hollywood. There's no Italian film industry that's been swallowed up by... The only film industry which has not been swallowed up by Hollywood is Indian film industry. And that's because of the songs. Ultimately, the strength of Indian film industry, in fact, is represented by someone like A.R. Rahman, who in fact brings to it all the various strands. It's not an accident, I think, I'm slightly going from the main part, that A.R. Rahman, who was a Hindu and converted to Islam, was actually led to do so by his influenced by a Sufi master. He met a Sufi and so on. So in fact in A.R. Rahman and in his music you see the various strands in the history of Indian music. So we come to the present day and of course new art forms are coming up, the new art forms are coming, electronics is coming up, laser is coming up, and these all affect our languages in various ways. When the skies opened up and terrestrial television came and so on, there was fear in India that India would be flooded by Western newscasters, that Western companies would come and Indian television would be full of what West would do. But actually that didn't happen. What happened with channels came when satellite television came and so on, what happened was actually the new channels which came up in Indian languages. They came in Marathi, in Hindi, and this. And today, the Indian languages are going through a very conflicting situation. On one side, what's happening is because of the attraction of electronics, people are sending their children to English medium schools. Even my driver borrowed 5,000 rupees without telling me from someone else to send his son to get him admitted to an English medium school, because he felt if he learnt English medium school, then he will learn his electronics and, and so on. And there is a real fear voiced in all over India that Indian languages may be dying out because people are not sending their children to their mother tongue language. Along with it, however, all the channels that are coming out, all the television that they hear, are all in their mother tongues. All in. So on one side you have language as a language of writing, administration and reading, where they seem to be dying out, and yet they are, as performing media, they are now flourishing. As you know, India has 20 languages, and 28 states in 20 languages, and not all these 20 languages, but certainly something like 8 to 10 are now in their full health because the mother tongue is coming alive in the spoken language. And the mother tongue cultures are stronger than ever before. And then ultimately you come to, of course, computers, and the computers and the electronic media. The final thing I mentioned earlier, that one of the things that the British did was to divide the country among the cities and the outside. In medieval India, there was no disjuncture. The people lived in cities and they were in touch with the villages, and there was a continual flow which was broken by the British, because under the British, the city became the place for everything. If you wanted medicine, the hospital was in the city. If you wanted to go to the government office, you had to go to the city. If you want to go to college, you have to send children to the city. If you had any training, you have to go to the city. The city became the center of knowledge, and the countryside became the area of backwardness. It was people would come from the countryside to the city because everything was available only in the city. And the flow has continued, and of course, the way, you can see it in the way that our cities are exploding and countryside is getting degraded. But the hope is that computronics, electronics, the electronic media will reverse the thing, because today you don't need to come to the city physically to learn anything. You can be in another place, you can be in your village, and if our educational systems can be geared in such a way that the electronic media can be properly used, then it would still be possible, I think, to have a very rich and productive countryside along with a rich and productive city life, which would be culturally, culturally rich and creative. Well, thank you very much for asking me. I don't know whether what I said made sense or not, but I'm glad to have this opportunity. Thank you very much.